Hi there, it's Ian from learnpracticalgis.com, and I want to talk to you today about the lakefront study, which is on page 12 and 13 of the free ebook that you guys downloaded. Now, my idea is that what I'll do is I'm going to send you out a bunch of emails talking about, starting off talking about some of the things, the projects in that free ebook, and then move on to things such as, what is a geographical information system, what's a point, what's a line, what's a polygon, how do you build data sets and all that sort of stuff. What's metadata, rah, rah, rah. But for the moment, what my thinking is that you're better off understanding some of the ways that geographical information systems can be used before we start talking about all that stuff. Now, if you disagree, I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong. You can leave some comments for me on Facebook, on my Facebook page, Learn Practical GIS. Less so on Twitter. I'd prefer it on Facebook because you can write a little bit more on there. Give me a bit more detailed feedback. So would appreciate that if you would. Tell me if the videos are too long. I'm a bit worried about that, but I just want to get some stuff in them. Anyway, let's get on to talking about this lakefront project. Now, the background to this is that around the world, particularly in Australia, we have these things called paper townships, and what these are when the boosters and all these sort of people at certain points in time go in and they just basically draw lines on a map and say this is going to be a town. And in the times when they did this, they were quite different times in terms of what the planners' expectations were, what environmental expectations were, and what community expectations were. So in Australia in particular, there's a lot of these paper townships. Now, the problem is that these days the environmental standards are quite different. And where you have a paper township and the blocks being so small, like we're talking, 300 square meters or 300 square yards, or those sorts of measurements, just small house blocks, basically the size of you'd put a small shop on it or something like that. Some of these blocks are in this particular area. They're actually a bit too small to deal with the wastewater that's produced by any of the houses that are on these blocks. Now, when I say that, what you have, and this is the background to this problem I'm talking about, where you have a township that's away from a wastewater treatment plant, that wastewater has to be treated somehow on site, and generally it's via the likes of a septic tank, and the wastewater, after it's treated in a primary fashion in the septic tank, gets disposed of in the soil, where the soil fauna and flora and so forth eats it all up, going yum yum yum, that's a yummy dinner, thank you very much. Except you have to have the right sort of soil to do that. Now, if you've got clay soils, what you get is that they're so good at holding water, like that's what you make pots and crockery out of and so forth, that the water doesn't make it into the soil pores. And on the other hand, you get very, very sandy soils, and where they're very, very sandy, what tends to happen is that they go straight through the soil and they get disposed of very readily. But what they do is that the wastewater either makes it to groundwater, or it makes it to nearby streams, and in this case the local lake, a very large lake system. And you really don't want people swimming in sewage or drinking sewage. And if you haven't watched already the post that I did on my site, titled "Doctor removes pump handle from well and ends cholera outbreak," you won't fully understand or you may, but if you watch this video, you'll certainly will have a good understanding of how important water quality is for health. So what we had in this particular circumstance was a paper township where people have bought blocks of land with the expectation that with that block of land that they own, that they can build a house on it. So these are, this is an area in the middle of nowhere, and a lot of these people were battlers looking for a place to retire cheaply, and they think, well, yeah, we'll buy a block of land there for, you know, a few $1,000s or whatever. We'll be able to build a little shack on it, and at least we'll be able to retire comfortably. Well, until local government gets involved, because local government has to respond to a whole bunch of environmental criteria from more senior departments in government, those being environmental protection agencies, state government regulations and so forth. And basically this local government responsible for this area was not in a position to allow people to build on these very small lots. So what they said was, if you own blocks of land next to each other, we're going to amalgamate those blocks of land into a single, what we call a title, a single title, where you get a development right attached to that one single, well, block of land, let's say. So you've got 3 or 4 blocks of land. Council says you don't have 3 or 4 blocks anymore, you now have 1. And with that 1, you can build a house on it if you want. Now, some of these people not only had bought these blocks of land to retire on, some of them had bought them for investments to sell at the time they've retired. So there's a fair bit riding on this for some people. You know, you've got a block of land on, you know, 1 minute that has a development right attached to it. A little bit down the track, just a couple of weeks down the track, all of a sudden you've lost that right to develop or to build a house on it. That block of land is worth a whole heap less. So that has very big implications for, have I gone back one? Yes, sorry, I clicked the button. That has very big implications for people's retirement plans. So we went, before, at the time we were called in to work on this project, a colleague and myself, and this is just one of a number of different sorts of projects I work on, and we'll call this a planning project, or environmental planning project maybe. The meeting prior to us being involved was so angry that they had to call security. All right, security had to be called to create a bit of calm in the meeting and to eject a couple of people, I understand, as well. After we were involved, the landowners were sitting around or standing around drinking tea and eating biscuits with the council officers. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is, I feel, open planning, participatory planning, enabling, allowing the community to participate in the planning process and having a more open process and explaining to the public, you know, the reasons why some things are happening and asking for feedback on the aspects that are within council's control to deal with. Because as you will become aware, as I go through these videos, that I'm very aware that these days people's BS meters are finely tuned, right? They don't put up with rubbish anymore from council and local government and all levels of government. Government is losing its power to community activism that's driven or enabled by social media and other sort of expectations that people have. So you see this around the world at the moment. Particularly you see governments falling and being challenged by communities that now use the likes of Facebook and things like that to communicate with and create communities, special interest communities. So government needs to be on its toes. Now, this sort of project that I'm talking about here is a bit of a leading project. It's not a lot of local governments are doing this, and we still find that we come into local governments to fix problems rather than to use this GIS technology in a communicative manner, to communicate problems and get feedback from various members of the community, because maps are a particularly good way of doing that. Just wonderful as a communication means, and I'll talk about that a bit in the book, in the ebook. But let's move on with this talk. So what we're talking about is spatially consistent planning. So this local government was dealing with a certain number of guidelines from the Environmental Protection Agency, Victoria's Environmental Protection Authority, EPA, that they had to respond to, and these guidelines, a lot of them could be mapped using a geographical information system. So they prescribed, for example, that you needed to have setbacks from watercourses and water bodies. And I think the prescription was 60 metres in this case from any water body. And this particular development or estate, paper estate, was surrounded by water. But we have hydrography maps. We have maps of where the water is and where the water bodies are and where the streams are. So you can map those using geographical information systems. And GIS has a buffering capability where you can say, okay, this watercourse buffer at 60 metres in this case. Steepness of slope. We can look at steepness of slope on in a geographical information system as well. We can map that. We can create a map of slope. So what we have is what we call a digital terrain model, which is a map of heights over the estate, and in this case I think it was on every 5 metres we had a height, and because you have a difference in heights, the GIS is able to work out the slope. So we're able to create a slope map. Suitability of soils. All right. In this case, so what we were talking about before was that clay soils hold too much water. Sandy soils are too transmissive. What you want is some sort of loamy soil halfway between sands and clays that are just right, like the Three Bears. Now, where do you get this sort of stuff, the soil mapping? You get from a lot of times you can get archival soil mappings, but mostly the work I get involved with is actually creating the soil maps with soil scientists. Now, this is a tricky process, and we'll talk about that, how to create these sorts of maps in other videos. But one really, really important thing that you're going to hear me just go on and on and on about is the importance that the scale of the map the maps you're using match the scale of the decision making that you're undertaking. So there's no sense having some regional map of watercourses and relating that to an estate, because at a regional scale, a lot of the time small watercourses aren't even mapped. Okay, so non-environmental GIS maps can also be incorporated, such as cadastral information. Now, cadastre is the term that we use to describe land ownership. It's a French term, and we look at these things called parcels or blocks and properties. But we'll go into that in another video again. There's a lot of videos, as you can see, and planning overlays. So what local government generally has is it'll have a series of different maps that say, okay, you're in an environmental area, this is an environmental overlay, and in an environmental overlay you're not allowed to take out trees. Or you're maybe in an overlay, in a residential overlay. In a residential overlay area, you're not allowed to have a factory and stuff like that. Okay, so we can bring all that sort of information into it. So once you pull this information we need to pull this information together. The question that we were charged with to inform policy making and so forth was, is the portion of a land parcel that is unaffected by the constraints, those being slope and proximity to watercourse, is that parcel of a sufficient size to dispose of its wastewater on site when taking into account the local soil conditions? Okay, so we've not only got these constraints, these setbacks that you can map, the setback from the watercourse and the slope that we can map using a GIS. We also have to take into account the soil information. Let's have a look at this estate. And we saw this, I didn't really talk about this in the previous video. I just had it up there so you could see how small the blocks were. So the sort of information that we had was a contour map, and I digitised this contour map myself off an old paper map, right, that was screwed up and a whole bunch of things, and it was photocopied a number of times and rah. So it wasn't a very reliable map, but we had no other contours for the area, so we had to use it. So this idea of understanding the pedigree of the data that you're using, inputting into any of these sorts of GIS projects, is another thing I'm going to rabbit on about. Okay, so you're probably getting the idea that I've worked a lot with lots of different sorts of data over the years. Okay, so we had an aerial photo, we had the property information, you can see the blocks, and we had this contour information, which I didn't think was very reliable, but it was better than naught. We had to produce a soil map, and what we did was this. When you're doing this sort of projects, there's two things that you have to do. One is that you have to go in and use what we call a soil auger, which is you drill down a bit and you take a sample of the soil and you run it between your hands and you have a sniff of it and you look at it in the light and go, well, that's a lovely colour, and rah, and you say, oh, that's a sand, that's a clay, that's a silt, that's a loam, that's a whatever. Okay, that's one thing you do. The other thing we have to do is we have to do permeability tests, and a permeability test is basically testing how quickly water can go through a soil profile. Okay, and what we determined using all this magic that we got from the various tests was that for a 3-bedroom house, and that we considered that to be an average house that would likely to have been put on this estate, that uses tank water, because if you use tank water you're going to use less water than if you get water straight out of a tap from a town supply, because with the tank you're just far more aware that it's more precious. On clay soils, those soils that don't absorb a lot, right, you're going to need at least 1100 square metres of block size in order to dispose of the wastewater on site. And with the sandy soils, you're going to need at least 650 square metres. Right, so what we're saying is that the blocks in these shallow clay areas that we mapped need to be at least 1100 square metres, and in these sandy soils, they need to be at least 650 square metres. Okay, so we're starting to, and what we did is in a community forum, we took the community through this series of maps that I'm showing you at the moment. Okay, and we talked about how we did our soil surveys. We talked about the constraints that are imposed by different levels of government and so forth. And we made them aware that we only had a little bit of, local government only had a little bit to play with. Okay, then we brought in these slope and buffer constraints. So the Environmental Protection Authority has guidelines that restrict wastewater treatment or on-site wastewater treatment or septic tanks on slopes steeper than 20% or closer than 60 metres to a water body. So what we had is we had this this map of slopes. And yeah, look, the legend hasn't come across here, I'm terribly sorry. But basically these dark areas are very steep slopes. And what I think I did was I actually said, okay, if a slope is greater than 25% instead of 20%, 25%, that it's constrained. If it's between 15 and 25%, you need to inspect it with an on-site inspection. And if it's any less than that, it's not constrained at all, because I was really worried about the mapping quality. I did the mapping, created my own map of the streams, and we see that here, and buffered that map by 60 metres. So what you see immediately is a lot of areas that are constrained in one way are also constrained in a different way. So they might be constrained by the steep slopes and also because of the buffer from the watercourse, their proximity to a watercourse. Okay, so a lot of this area in the buffer is constrained anyhow. So once again, we're talking to the landowners, we're talking them through this, and they're asking questions and so forth all the way through. Then there's a policy overlay. Okay, so local government in this case has a policy, and it actually owns a good chunk of this area as well. So the shaded areas represent land that's owned by council that are low intensity in a low intensity use zone, are existing open space or planned open space. In other words, these are the shaded areas are areas that council have a lot of control over. Okay, so if in this previous in this previous map, you know, there's a whole bunch of areas that are affected by the constraints, but when we actually look at them, a lot of them are owned by council anyhow. Okay, and can we see this idea of map overlay coming up? See, I can just overlay these maps on top of each other. We can see that sort of thing happening. Okay, now this is the idea of map overlay. Now if you haven't seen the Ian McHarg video, once again on my website, where I talk about the story of map overlay, you need to have a look at that. That's a very, very important video. Okay, so we're doing map overlay. We've looked at the policy overlay. Okay, so when I overlaid all the constraints, okay, so we're looking at the soil map and the areas associated with the soil types. The clay soils 1100 metres, the sandy soils 650 metres. When we overlay that onto the slope and the water buffer constraints, okay, and then we overlay council-owned land on top of that, what we see is those dark areas are those areas that are constrained from being developed, and those clear areas are those areas that could be developed, right? According to the existing land ownership and the existing and the existing zonings and so forth. Now, when we showed this, there was just, I got to say, the audience became very unsettled, very, very unsettled. And I had to move on to the next slide very quickly, because what we then showed was, okay, this is council's proposal. Okay? And council's proposal was to amalgamate the lots in a particular way. And it sort of showed in actual fact that council didn't get it too far wrong. In this area, it had some problems, right? But elsewhere, you know, there was a lot of lots that could be developed. What this sort of map allows people to do is it allows them to see their block of land in relationship to the constraints and in relationship to their neighbour's block of land. Because in these sort of circumstances, one of the really, really big things that rankles with the landowners is that their neighbours can do something when they can't. And this sort of approach to planning allows them to see if their neighbours can develop and they can't. It lets them see why. It lets them understand why. And there was people in the audience that night that, you know, they saw that they couldn't develop their land, that they couldn't build a house on it. But in the end, they actually had an understanding of why. They were disappointed and they were upset, but they were okay with it, right? Because they could see this sort of mapping. So the benefits of this approach is that when we were able to bring these high quality maps and that were relevant to this area's domestic wastewater plan, because we're talking about wastewater planning, the stakeholders, including the ratepayers in the public forum, seemed to be relaxed that the process was open. And the steering committee was also, because in projects like this you have government steering committees quite often, they were able to make their strategic decisions using evidence-based information. So a lot of what council had been doing up until this point was shooting from the hip. They were doing the best they could, but they didn't have all the information upon which to base their decisions. And I really have to applaud them for being game enough to do an open sort of planning process on this, considering the history of the estate. So what ended up happening there was, based on, I'll come back to here, based on this sort of information, what ended up happening is that this plan actually formed a really, really good foundation for the local government to be able to put up a proposal to other government agencies that allowed this, so that this area could be sewered. That was something like a $2 million project to sewer it. So it was, you know, pretty expensive, but you know, if blocks can be sewered, it means that they can be developed. So for the landowners, it allowed them to, it actually increased the value of their blocks quite significantly. Okay, so that's been me with this first video. Please give me feedback on my Facebook page. That way I can help you so much more. It will allow me to produce videos and work that you actually want to hear, rather than what I think that you want to hear. Okay, so look at the Facebook page. You can see me on Twitter, but please keep in touch and look out for further videos. This has been Ian from Learn Practical GIS, and watch out also for more emails. Bye bye.